Good evening. Welcome to Bayview. We are delighted that you're here tonight. We have a really wonderful opportunity in front of us. Don Saliers is a professor of theology and worship at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University and the author of 9 books, soon to be 10, I suspect. Emily Saliers is a member of the Indigo Girls, an award-winning folk rock duo known for their vibrant music and activism. Their speech tonight, or their conversation, will speak for itself. Together they have co-authored a book called A Song to Sing, A Life to Live, Reflections on Music as Spiritual Practice. And the performance of the Indigo Girls tonight at the Bayview Festival is our role as a Chautauqua that explores spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual development, made this a perfect opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with them. We welcome you both for this conversation on generational sameness and difference, as well as diversity of thought and how to move forward as a society, as well as within traditional structures such as churches. Please welcome Don Saliers and Emily Saliers.
Hello.
So I want to start with a quote to frame our conversation. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Is the real problem that we don't love ourselves or feel comfortable enough in our own skin? And if that's true, then maybe we're doing exactly what we were told to do. Perhaps we need to better love ourselves in all of our differences in order to love one another better. Those include our differences in faith, music, worship style, which you tackle so beautifully in the book. We hope that there will be a spirit of openness tonight to what all of us might learn together in the next hour, and let's just see where the Spirit leads us. Shall we begin? Emily, you have come to deeply appreciate your difference in style from that of your father and musical preferences. So our question is, how did you get there with your father in terms of appreciating these differences? And what wisdom might you share for others seeking to honor the ways in which God has spoken to them, as well as the way that he or she has spoken to others?
Good question. Well, we were reared in an environment of inclusivity, and so I had 3 sisters growing up, and we were all different, and as you might imagine, and Dad and Mom we went to church as a family. We were never forced to go to church, although it was kind of expected, I'd say. And then
it was expected.
And so, so it was expected, and we did go, but I never felt forced. But anyway, after church, we would come home and we would discuss what we'd heard about in church. And we were all pretty strong-minded young girls and of a liberal bent early on. And so in our household, we were invited to ask any question that we wanted. And Dad, being a theologian, he had a lot of answers about the history of things. But even to answer questions such as, well, how could there possibly be a Trinity? How can there be 3 in 1? And this is what, when you're like 8 or 9 or even 13, you just want to know, well, how? Well, why? Well, how could this be possible? And so Mom and Dad fostered an environment of asking and talking and not having, hard answers. And so I grew up happy to hear what my dad had to say and share. And so because he didn't, and Mom was the same way. And so I was open to Dad's experience of music, and we grew up, he cut his teeth on jazz, and Mom loved jazz, but also classical music. So we grew up on Saturday mornings. They had an LP collection, and they would listen to music. And so we were also fostered through music. But when I picked up a guitar, we could play whatever kind of music we wanted. So to answer your question, I came to appreciate Dad first and foremost because he created an openness about his experience in life and music and spirituality. And then I just think he's fantastic. He's wonderful organist and pianist, and he really believes that structuring a liturgy can help the experience of it, and I'm a firm believer in that. Very early on, he was a feminist. He understood feminist theologians' frustration with language, with pronouns, and so on. So, Dad, I've been he's my mentor in many, many ways. And there came a point in our relationship where I would say that we're almost closer to friends in some ways now, or at least in a way that we weren't before as I've gotten older. And so I taught him that rap music is also an important kind of music. I don't know if he was ready to hear that, but long-winded answer. He's gifted, he's knowledgeable, he's human. We have a lot of discussions about how we feel about things. And Mom and Dad both fostered openness.
So this openness is here, and yet you have divergent, interests, just as all of us do in musical styles. So what inspired the book then at that point? Was it something, a need in society that you saw, or something that you felt called to write together?
Wow. We'd been having these conversations for a long time, and sort of listening into each other's lives. What moved us musically? I remember your story about pulling the car over because you were hearing a classical piece of music. Happened to be Enigma Variations.
Elgar.
And she pulls the car over to listen. So I'm really interested in that. And then also interested in how music was taking her places. I'm just a white guy in church, so there are some limitations,
That makes two of us.
Yeah, okay. But we were always connected with African American communities, and Emily especially with South American, Cuban, Violeta Parra from Brazil? No.
She was
Peru?
From
Argentina. So, and I've known her all her life. This is the thing, is that it's very special then that when it came to these discussions, we were asked to write a little article for a book by Dorothy Bass. And we found it was such an enjoyable thing that we were really exploring aspects of each other that we really hadn't had a chance to talk about. So it was suggested to us, we think you got a book there. So what we did was get some really good coffee and sit down and start a conversation and record it. And so the first...
On a cassette, I think.
On a cassette, yeah.
Cassettes, yeah.
Yes, it was 1934, I think. Anyway, so the book emerged very naturally out of I think we can now say a lifetime's conversation about the relationship between music and grief, music and justice, music and joy, music and church, obviously, but also music. Saturday Night and Sunday Morning was our original title for the book, because both of us have that fusion going back and forth. My father was a New York jazz musician, so that was an advantage. So the book arose, shall we say, organically out of the fact that this was part of our life's discussion. We use an image at the opening of that book that you probably picked up called song lines. It's as though we had song lines that were crossing and listening to each other into speech about those song lines and kind of where has music taken us, where is it taking us? Those are kinds of things that lie in the background of the book. Yeah.
Let's talk about Saturday Night and Sunday Morning a little more then. I caught your wonderful interview with Krista Tippett on Being.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't know the program, it's a fantastic podcast. You should absolutely go online and get it. It's
She's remarkable.
Yeah.
very
Any of you know
evocative.
that, Krista Tippett's work? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, sure. Yeah.
She does all kinds of really wonderful spiritual topics, and your interview was particularly meaningful. My wife, once we knew we were booking you, and my wife said, "Oh my gosh, I just heard the girls talking to Krista Tippett. You got to check this out." And so we listened to it, and it was just, it was mind blowing. So I want to talk a little bit about the Saturday night, Sunday morning thing. Can you share with us maybe an experience or two where you have felt the presence of the divine in a Saturday night, in a concert, for instance, or you in a concert, or you in a church, or you in a church, either one? Just give us because I think all of us agree perhaps that the Spirit is present in all these different settings.
Yeah.
And may take different faces, but is probably all part of the same thing. So I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about an experience that you've had where that's been really meaningful for you.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that come to mind, but with regards to a Saturday night, Amy and I used to play at this place called Little Five Points Pub in Atlanta. We were kind of like the house bar band after a while. And it was a really motley crew of people. I mean, there were people who were strung out on drugs. There were people who played in all different kinds of bands. There was different people of different color and background and ages. It was, even intergenerational, even for a bar, And people would get up on stage with us. It was a bit of a hootenanny, so there was a real sense of community. But everybody was welcomed in that place. And I felt the power of music for gathering misfits. And of course, we were, and still are, gay. And at that time, it was not like it is now, where society was coming to be accepting more so than before. I mean, it was really, this was a bit of a panacea for us. So we had lesbians in the audience who could be comfortable being lesbians, and gay people. And the word queer wasn't as widely used back then, but it was a bunch of queers, really, And that means our straight allies as well, people who are, supportive of all different kinds of differences. And so truly, I felt the power of music as a spiritual gift to maintain and galvanize a community of very, very different people. And so Dad and I talked a lot about that in the book. And of course, anytime I hear an African-American gospel choir, I'm straight to God. I don't know why. That's just my direct route. So these are inexplicable things, really, but there was the bar, and then there's that in church. Bar church.
Yeah. Well, I would be, we'd be here a long time if I started talking about experiences with Mahler. Certainly with, I have a chamber group. I'm playing at the Bennington Chamber Festival this summer again. And either the wit of Poulenc that sort of says, this is a curious world and this music leads us somewhere. But also, I hung around Robert Shaw, and any of you who know the choral world know that when he did the Deutsche Requiem, the German Requiem, and what he could do with this, just this. He was rambunctious. He was a PK, and he wanted to reject all that stuff. But when he was in front of the chorus, God, it's like they say of Art Tatum, the great jazz player from Toledo, Ohio. My father was a jazz musician, and so I loved people from Ohio, Toledo and so on. There was a famous story about a cutting session, which was what you had when you came as a young jazz player. And Willie the Lion Smith, which is one of the great jazz players, was there. And so this young blind player from Toledo, Ohio, comes and plays a couple of courses of Sweet Lorraine, and there's silence. And instead of saying, "Get out of here, kid, where'd you learn to play?" Willie the Lion Smith said, "God is in the house." And that was the start of the incredible influence of Art Tatum. So when I hear Art Tatum's heartbreaking harmonies, or Miles Davis when he isn't trying to excoriate everybody, or John Coltrane. If any of you know John Coltrane's music, his religious quest is in that music. It's strange and bizarre and transcendent. And then, of course, B minor Mass. What could we say about Bach? I'm an organist, so I get to play some Bach. And there's no question in my mind that music takes us to the edge of transcendence. When it isn't simply engineered or used to be misogynist or stuff. We've had some interesting discussions on what stands in the way of music's ability to evoke the depth of our life and the depth of mystery.
Care to share?
Yeah, care to share?
Since you brought it up.
Well, let me put it this way. Because of Emily, I really love Hamilton. Right? And all of us should love Hamilton because that's a genius use of an idiom of music that some of us, me included, started out kind of resisting,
Well, we talked in the book about how their prejudices show up in people's vitriolic response to music that they're not familiar with. So a lot of times if people aren't familiar, say with rap, or even it happens with country, or my prejudice is against, what do they call that kind of jazz with a high C soprano sax? Smooth jazz. That's my deepest prejudice. But when a lot of times when
Your
you say,
grandfather loved it. Guy Lombardo. I mean, anyway.
Yeah, that
Sometimes known as snooze jazz.
Snooze jazz. Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't know what that's saying about. I don't know what the culture of snooze jazz is, but
Yeah.
I have a problem with it. But no, seriously, to say, you might hear a lot of people say, I can't stand that rap music. Well, we dug a little more deeply into that, and basically it's misconceptions about the cultural reality behind that music, and also what we might get exposed to, which is, the more in-your-face misogyny and violence, and but behind that is a cultural reality, and there are so many rap artists who are genius rap artists in their own, I try not to use the word genius too loosely, but truly, like I think that Hamilton is a piece of genius work.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with country, and you say, I can't stand country music, well, you're really talking about what you envision of the people who listen to country music and love country music. And so we explored a lot about what is vitriolic response to a kind of music say about what we're generalizing about. So that was interesting for us to have. I even told Dad, I had this friend who he was driving a semi and he heard Madonna's Ray of Light, and he pulled off the road and wept for whatever reason. That song unlocked something in him, and I was saying to Dad, now Dad, that is equally as valid as Bach's whatever. That moves me like sorry, I hit my mic, but Ray of Light is not going to move me like that. But it changed his life. So it is that power of music, and you've been very patient with our discussions about that.
No, I keep learning from you. That's the whole point of this lifetime.
Is that a euphemism? Learning from
Learning from you. Yeah. Don't compose a song called Learning from You. Anyway, you said something that's in the book. You prompted this in the book, and it goes back to your very first question to us. If you start hating people's music, like cultural music now, and not the kind of stuff you're talking about, after a while you have to dig into that. Are you not loving the people? And there is a connection, and you made this first point, and I think we make it in the book, that to love someone else's music, you can't help start loving them, or at least the cultural conditions that produce the music. And that's a huge transformation. And I guess the other thing I want to say in response to this is, tell me what your loves and your fears and your joys and what you're willing to praise and what you're willing to lament. I'll know more about you than if you tell me what you believe before breakfast. There's something about the lyrical mode of receiving the world, and that music touches down in our grief, in our joy, and our heartbreak, and what causes us to praise like a child. That's that linkage. And so I think that binds together a couple of the questions you've been asking.
I'm grateful for that way you brought that back in, because I was kind of wondering myself how I was going to do it, and I was thinking, I'm going to get back to that. But but now that we're talking about the way that we sort of prejudge people's music, let's use that as a transition into looking at the church and what's happening with the mainline church. All of us have spent various times in churches. Many of us know that mainline church of all sects, whether liberal or progressive or conservative, are in many cases in decline. And we also know that the society is becoming more secularized. And yet, at the same time, I think you would find more and more people that would identify themselves as spiritual.
Right.
And so for a lot of us, there are, I think, just as we have a prejudge musical styles, I think there are, when we say spiritual, that for many of us has prejudgmental sort of, we have a reaction, a visceral reaction, just as when we say religion or organized religion or things like that. So if we look at the next generation, the millennials, Generation X, Y, Z, whatever it is, and we have this deep hunger for, I think, connection to something divine or something larger than us, if not specifically God.
Yeah.
And yet we also have this secularization movement. How do we, those of us that do care about the church, either big C or little c church, how do you envision us recreating that in a way that makes it still relevant for the future?
Well, a couple of words and then
Yeah.
I throw the ball to you. We've got to be far more honest about the real questions that haunt us. The best of our teachers, the best of our moral exemplars, the best of our religious heroines and heroes had room for doubt in the midst of faith, whether you're talking about St. Augustine or Dorothy Day. So the first thing is honesty. And I think a new generation is looking for that. They're looking also for something that motivates people to do good in the world. And we've learned a lot about the checkered history of the church. We know that it's not all been, sweetness and light. Mm-hmm. I mean, I love the joke that who did Blazing Saddles and
Mel Brooks.
Mel Brooks, yeah. Remember when he said, "Hello, we're the people that brought you the Inquisition." You remember that? I mean, so I think these are just three small fragments. One is the need for honesty, mm-hmm. the need to address real human questions, and when the church gives pablum mm-hmm. instead of deep gospel, people are going to say, "Not for me." Mm-hmm. And when the church doesn't live the way it speaks. Mm-hmm. Now that's a problem for all of us. It's a problem for me. I don't live up to all of my ideals. But if one can get in that connection, mm-hmm. I also think that another generation is looking for deep ritual. Mm-hmm. Interesting enough, I find in some of your concerts ritual patterns mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. where the music takes us into the rituals of our life, ordinary life, and so mm-hmm. on. Those are just hints and guesses, but I think those are some things that I think we need to keep paying attention to. Mm-hmm. Another thing that we got to watch out for is the images that film and social media give of Christianity. It's a very weak image. And we need a much more robust, strong image of what it is to be a living human being who risks faith. So that's an introduction. I don't know, what do you think about that?
I agree with everything you've said. I think, and the media portrayal of church is very important. The media takes a delight in presenting something that's horrific, like God hates fags, or, it's so easy to get the soundbite religion and portray that. It's a lot more difficult. I mean, with our attention spans, just generally speaking, with regards to the media, we don't want to hear an in-depth conversation like this. Are you kidding me?
Thank God for Bayview, right? I'd say. Yeah.
I mean, this is one wonderful thing that Krista Tippett does is, I want to listen to everything she says and what she brings out in people. But this is not really the typical way that we do. I watch CNN and I hit that story and then I hit that story and then I hit that story. So you're going to hit stories of the church that's presented as right wing and saying these awful things. But also in my own life, as a gay person, I've known so many people who have been completely ostracized by the church, kicked out of the church, fire and brimstone. It doesn't even have to be fire and brimstone. The United Methodist Church, the language of the church says homosexuality is not compatible with the teachings of Christ. I find that deeply offensive. I'm finding it harder and harder to reconcile that. No pun intended.
Reconcile.
So I think that people have actually been hurt and their lives have been wounded. And when you just want to believe in God and live a life of faith and work in your community towards change, and you want to be part of all the beauty that organized religion can give, because I grew up with it, the rituals, the hymns, the seasons of hymnody and topics, and the color purple and the albs changing and all that stuff that is profound. My profound experience of Christianity, but that takes sort of a lifelong living of that. I know very few people who have left the church who grew up with an open experience of it, but I know a ton of people who have left because they felt judged and they've been hurt. And once you get wounded in that center of your faith and you question the validity of your being in the house of God, it's very difficult to ever go back.
Yeah.
The other, yes, we should have a pause. That's weighty. That's weighty.
I agree.
The other thing is that a lot of young people are looking for justice in a world that is so unjust and so oppressed with systems. And so I think there is a profound tradition in Christianity. If any of you have read the papal encyclical, Laudato Si, I don't know whether any of you do, run, don't walk to your nearest bookstore and get the papal encyclical, because it's about environment and justice and integrity and so on.
But
Now,
who would know to get that?
Well, I don't know. I'm telling people, go get it.
No, I know. Just
what you mean.
to the point of
Yeah.
how do people, I didn't mean to interrupt except to say, how do people access that kind of source? You know,
Right,
how do they
right.
find out about it?
Yeah, well, the church is very poor in giving us substantive stuff like this, you know, out of the tradition. I mean, when people say traditional worship, it's usually what started in 1956, you know, and it's associated with a lot of tremolo on the organ. Oh, come on, you know. I play a tracker instrument, and it's severe and wondrous, and you can make wonderful sounds out of it. And I heard you with this choir. Some of you were here that were in the other day. This guy's really good with the choir, isn't he? Yeah. So you know. But if I think about the Christian tradition's emphasis on facing the gap between the is of the world and the ought to be of the world, and there's justice. So I think that's another factor that people are looking for, hunger for that.
Yeah.
And we certainly find it all through the spirituals. And for me, I can't think of the spirituals without thinking of the Psalms, lament and praise, the rhythms of our life. And I wonder what kind of exposure to that we're getting in a lot of our churches.
You talked a little bit about that earlier today, just you and I, when we were chatting, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit more. The role of music in opening us to the idea of grief and allowing us to work through grief. Either one of you want to comment on that?
You start, Dad. I got to think about that because I'm thinking of the some of the women hymn writers like Mel and others who speak to grief in the context of beautiful. They would sound like traditional hymns.
Yeah.
And they're beautiful, but within the words are a message of suffering and.
Well, I mean, the crazy thing about Christianity is that at the center of it is a crucified God, to use, you know, Jürgen Moltmann's famous phrase, and we sometimes don't take that seriously, that the God who created everything invests the world with God's own love, and look what happens. And that's pain and that's grief. And in the Catholic tradition, you've got the Marian tradition of Mary's heart is pierced with a sword because of the death of this she gave birth to. I think if we don't come to terms with grief, and that's where music, think of the requiems, think of the Bach B minor Mass, think of the settings of the lament psalms. That Brian Wren, you know the composer, hymn writer Brian Wren? When pain and terror strike by chance, he wrote. And then we think of 9/11. When pain and terror strike by chance, we crave an all-controlling force, but instead we find a vulnerable God in the midst of it. That kind of language and that kind of deep music. There's a psalm setting. See, is it? My soul is thirsting. My soul is thirsting. Oh, my soul is thirsting for you, oh Lord my God. That's a jazz setting of Psalm 63. I'm not making it up, it's in the Bible. And when you find a musical setting like that of a simple psalm, and I don't know what your reaction was to that, but I love that setting of it, simply because it accents one side of it. And some of your music comes very close. When Emily and I do little concerts together, we just did one out at General Conference in Portland, and sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
Wayfarer and Stranger.
Wayfarer and Stranger. Wayfarer and Stranger. And
You want to bust some of that out right now?
Well,
That-
can we do it?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Can you do it? Okay. Well, we were thinking of that, and immediately we're thinking of Syrian refugees.
Or the immigration crisis
Or
in
the
this country. And
Immigration crisis. I mean, somehow just below the surface of some of these songs that come from the tradition, and some of your songs, I think, is this entrance into a world that needs to be set right. And to go back to your earlier question, I mean, you meet people all the time, and I meet people all the time that wish it were so, that there were communities like this who really kept that up front, you know? What it's, just that falling harmonic line is like we feel.
did you end in a major?
I did. That's called, for those of you who like it, Picardy third. Anyway.
I think too. I mean, you've mentioned classical pieces and hymns and so on, and I think just in the context of popular music or folk music, most of us know the experience of listening to a sad song when we're sad, which might seem, you know, there's some sort of way that there's a catharsis through our grief by listening to a sad song. And if any one of you is like me in this particular way, listen to it over and over and over again, and just strangely, we can feel better through that experience of music. It's healing. And I think that most human beings do not like to sit in discomfort. They do not like to sit in lament. It's like, let's move on to the next thing that can make us feel better or change the way we feel. And but if you sit in music and you stay in a piece that is exploring lament and grief, then you, as long as the piece lasts, at least you are sort of forced to sit in it if you'll experience it without shutting down internally.
You sound just like T.S. Eliot.
I do?
Yes. He said, music heard so deeply that you are the music while the music lasts.
That's how I feel about music.
Yeah.
That's exactly
That's
how I
why
feel about.
Yeah.
We were, I noticed some of my riffraff from the band is back there, and we were talking about, hello. We were talking about Change Is Gonna Come, Sam Cooke's version.
Great song.
And my friend Jordan had a mixtape of many different recorded versions of that particular song. But Sam Cooke's, there was none like Sam Cooke's, and because he lived it, you know, the African American experience of slavery, and then trying to find a way post-slavery, and still trying to find a way, and that hope. I know a change is going to come, but it's so deeply sad and hopeful in the same piece of music. So I think that's a really good example of music that can help us move through grief and still have hope, but it's not like it's been bad, but it's gonna be great. You know, it's
honest.
Yeah, honest, like Dad said. Yeah.
How about Psalm 130? Out of the depths I cry unto you. Why are you laughing? Why are you laughing? I mean, this is the problem of incongruity. When the world is one way and we pretend that it isn't, and then sing our songs.
So can we talk about that for a second? Because I
sure,
think it's a thing that we talk about, the honesty of the church and the next generation wanting a real authenticity, and I think, dare I say, a humility in what we, as believers, we believe. To say, we believe, but to your point, we also have doubt. And so when you have an intentional community like a church, or a place like this community, where people come for respite, they come to recharge, they come to find, I think, to find the divine in these thin places in the universe, as we like to say in our house. How do we do that, but then also stay honest and engaged in a world where, name your crisis or your travesty of justice, whatever it is, how do we intentionally live in a place that's so beautiful, or live such a privileged life as, admittedly all three of us probably live now, and yet stay fully engaged in a world that is truly hurting?
It's a good question. I think that for me, I realize that I am not the wisest. There is a greater power, much wiser than I, and I put my faith in the power, and even through tragedies and the onslaught of the terrible things that happen because of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and this doesn't make me want to be less active in trying to effect change, but there is a little kernel deep inside that's like, I'm going to call it God, because that's just the word I use.
Oh, it's someone who loves God. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I love God. I call it God. God understands. It's silly to even try to describe what God understands compared to what I understand. And so I have that faith. And sometimes it's challenged. Things get really hard. I don't know how people who continue to suffer systemic injustice continue to have faith. It's amazing to me. But, because I do live a life of privilege. But I think, too, that there have to be escapes from tragedy and darkness, and as a songwriter, I can just get really, really overwhelmed by the sadness and horror in the world, and so that's why I watch pro football on Sundays in the fall, and like, I've learned that escape from darkness is a real blessing, and that I don't have to feel bad about taking a little break from absorbing the world. But also, there are opportunities all day long, every day, to engage with people, to, on a very simple level, just communicate with another human being, or to not shoot somebody, the bird, if you're road raging, or to just to approach, but you said, love one another as yourself. Like the golden rule, it's really easy to apply if you remain mindful about it. So I kind of believe in the macro and the micro. And then I have that kernel of faith that is comforting to me, that there is a way that the world moves. I mean, we're so in it, but think about the vastness of the universe, and beyond. So I don't know if that was rambly, but that's kind of how I think
that's probably that verse, be in the world but not of the world. Yeah. Maybe that ability to separate that which we're going through and that which we know to be true on a larger scale.
And tonight we're going to hear a lyric from that ragtag band. The hardest to learn is the least complicated.
Oh, yeah.
That is a motto for me, too, because I'm right with you on that. So you get little epiphanies from music that you think isn't in church. In fact, more perhaps. Something epiphs more sometimes for me in one of their concerts or another kind of concert than I sometimes get in a kind of flat EKG church service. Yeah. Flat EKG, nothing on the oscilloscope. But the other factor that your question points us to, you gotta hang around people. You can't just hang around with your own tribe, especially if the tribe is like me, comfortable, tra-la-la, academic, tra-la-la. And that's what I've admired too about you and Amy working on Native American reservations, going down to the Chiapas in Mexico, all kinds of the Vieques. All these stories that we tell about where you were. I'm glad I didn't know when you were down with the Zapatistas. I'm glad
we just told Mom and Dad we were going to Mexico.
Yeah, they said, we thought, oh, Cancun, that's great, So they were down with mestizos, with the native folks struggling with justice. So you live what you just said, and I think this is another factor. You got to hang around people. I remember visiting the barrio in San Antonio, and I was told beforehand, now these are very poor people, and they don't have much. One of the greatest fiestas I ever experienced was in the barrio in San Antonio. How is it possible to live on so little? As you said of your first visit to Cuba, those musicians live on tortillas and air. How is it possible? You know? And so you got to hang around people who know a secret to life that your tribe may not know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Totally.
Yeah. And I think we're looking for that too.
I wonder, we'll do one last question for the two of you, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A in a second.
We'll talk about
Along those lines, though, I think, how do I say, there are communities that are outside the ones that look like the three of us. You know, you've mentioned the Black Gospel Church. We've traveled to Ghana, West Africa. You've traveled the whole world. I mean, there are places where they don't have half of the material things that we have, and yet there's this joy. What I'm curious about is there a way for us to have a church, you know, in the future that has that kind of joy in the sort of, you know, neighborhoods like where we live? Or is that something that's in your DNA really, really deep from, you know, your connection with a history that was not quite as pleasant as ours? You know, do you need to have that kind of struggle in order to have that kind of joy in this life?
Wow.
And how do we adopt that into the sort of mainline,
Yeah.
you know, very proper, austere kind of white church?
Two things, and then again, you're probably much better at this than I, but I do think that the appearance of global music in the church's vocabulary has really been a starting point. Now, there's such a thing as tokenism and just singing it and think, you know, it's kind of kumbaya, you know.
Right.
But I think the appearance of genuine interest in global music takes us back to that earlier point. Oh, I love, take something as popular as Siahamba, you know, which we didn't sing, and now we sing it. Cuando el pobre, when a poor one walks with strangers, then we know that God walks with that. And it's in that Hispanic rhythm. When we sing that, at least it gives the church a little teasing taste of another culture. Then you got to be careful not to play cultural tokenism.
Exactly. I was just sitting here thinking that.
I know you were thinking that.
Yeah.
I could tell. You know. But I do think that's a small start to crossing over into a different culture, and therefore there are different people that sing. Sometimes when I sing a psalm on a Sunday morning, I say, how many people in how many cultures and how many languages have prayed this psalm before I got here, and how many after me? And that puts it whole different context, and it takes us out of our cultural captivity.
Right.
And I think that's the question you're asking, how to do that. I think it can be done musically, gently, and strongly. It's got to be matched with other things. When I walk into a church, my test of the theology of the place is who they pray for and how they pray. Much more than the sermons. And what musical settings of the prayer do we hear? In the hymns or in the chants or whatever. I mean, I'm quite serious about that.
Yeah.
That's a kind of a criterion. How broad, how deep, how high, how passing, Agincourt, of course. But I'm thinking, sorry, I tripped.
No, I love it. I love it. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
I have to look up 10 things after I listen to Dad talk. I wish I could be Googling right now.
Yeah. But especially I think we've got a little start there when we're exposed outside of the immediate repertoire that is our comfort zone. And it can happen, and is happening. But then we've got to follow it up with a way of life that exemplifies that.
Yeah.
You know? I don't know. What does that stimulate in you?
It's just all very, very interesting stuff. I mean, I'm thinking that there will never be a world church that speaks to all, and there's a place for all different kinds of congregations and experience of worship, and you know, there will never be one political party. There will never be one one whatever. You know, we have a lot of different interests, and we come from different places, and we have different needs, and some of us need to be surrounded and very protected and comfortable, and some of us need to experience hate because that's all we know, and some of us need this and that. And so I think, like, I'm thinking if the church shrinks and shrinks and denominations become sects, well, what's the purpose in scrambling to save the church when the church isn't working? Like, I believe that congregations that work will work for people, and they will remain vibrant and alive. And I think a lot of the problem comes with the systemic issues of organized religion. You know, when we say organized religion, as if we maybe don't even know what it means anymore. Like spiritual, we don't even know what that means anymore. A lot of us, I don't anyway. And so I think because for me, going back to the importance of the ritual, and when I hear hymns that I grew up with, there's nothing that replaces, even if they're hymns with a male pronoun for God or whatever, like, I'm able to filter that because my experience is through the ritual of that, how that informed my faith. And I don't think that I could worship in a church that threw all that aside to adapt to a modern world where everything was, we're trying to please everybody, and we'll get the Spanish hymn in, and we'll, let's sing about the poor people there, and then, well, we got to have a jazz band, and then we got to, you know, I just think that groups of people are going to create and be mindful about, but the basic message is those congregations or churches that are accepting and preach of love and of lament and all the things that the Psalms, I mean, and also recognize what we got from our Jewish brothers and sisters, like the integration and acceptance of where Christianity came from in many of its tenets and sacred literature. I think people will come to those places. And if fewer come, I mean,
It's like a good forest fire, you know, like it just sort of burns it and then it grows up after the forest fire,
I mean,
right?
I think that the important thing is to stay mindful in the experience of worship, and someone else is really in charge of what's going to happen. But I don't think that we in the church need to be like, what's going to happen to the church? You know, and if there need to be splits,
I like that.
like in the UMC, how is that going to be reconciled ultimately when the language literally cuts out so many people specifically? I just think there will come a time where it's like, you took the vote year after year after year after year after year, and it got closer, but because of the conservative churches that, you know, anyway, I'm going to go on a tirade about missionary work and, you know, all that stuff. But I think you get my point. The churches that are vibrant will remain alive, and the numbers may be smaller, but they'll be doing God's work.
And there's nothing wrong with a remnant faith community. Remnant faith community. I mean, we heard this fantastic lecture on the Holocaust today. It reminded me of so many things, including the Passovers that were celebrated under absolutely hellacious situations, and Elie Wiesel, you know, and so on. But I guess I do want to say that a remnant church might have something to say more powerfully than a broad sort of vanilla church, and that's all right. It's happened before in the history of faith communities. But I want something like you. I mean, I was just sitting here asking, who's the theologian here when you're saying this? Because theology has every right and responsibility, Christian theology now, I speak, to ask these questions. The kinds you've put to us. The kind you feel the force of these questions, don't you? I mean, I think you do. I feel the energy here. So the other thing is, how can we live according to what we sing? And if we sing that, you know, Robert Shaw was a great critic of the church, and I hope this doesn't offend someone, but he used to say, how can those churches sing all that swill on Sunday morning? And But I have to be personal about this. The last time I was here, my wife was with me. She was on the way to death. I didn't know it at the time, but there were people here who sensed that. She was over in your library, and there was a children's librarian over there. Some of you may know who that was. 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And there was something about the connection there, and we have to make those connections between people. And how that gets encoded in song is really, really interesting, I think. We've exhausted ourselves here.
Yeah.
We
We have time for just a couple of questions.
yeah, that's it.
When we used to tour with the opera, if you would come down to the mic here, that'd be great. When we used to
there's
tour
a
with
mic.
the opera company, we always had to tell the young kids that a question begins with who, what, when, where, or why.
Oh, okay.
Just so there's, because our time is short, so we need to go right to the question. Please.
Thank you. Are we on?
Hello.
Hi.
I feel very privileged to even ask a question in this very intimate family conversation. It's been a real privilege to hear from the two of you and Chris. My question, though, is we've heard about God, we've heard about Mary. Who is this man, Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
Good question.
Well, I did talk about the fact that God's love came embodied in a human life, and that's at the center of Christianity. Without that, nothing. Without that, nothing. The thing about that is that it's not just a doctrine. It's the way God invests the world continually. And so I want to say absolutely central, certainly to my theology, and Emily should speak to this. To put it another way lyrically, he is the feast, the story, the song, the prayer. Well, another way to put it from my standpoint is his liturgy is going on in the world. Long before we got here, long after we got here. We're conjoined to what that life, that resurrection, that power of love is doing in the world. And so many of us have to catch up with that. Is that a start? Very central notion of the distinctiveness of Christian claims here.
I think of Jesus as the epitome of the coming together of humility and ultimate power. Only exists in him as far as any other human being I've ever thought about. And he was a great comforter, but also suffered anger, knocked over some tables, healed the sick,
Yeah.
allowed the outcast women to be near him, hung out with the riffraff.
Yeah.
Just the beautiful epitome of the most that a human being can be, but came completely from a divine humility.
It's beautiful.
So we keep trying, but I don't think we're going to get there. We just keep trying, and that's the hope. The hope is that we have this wonderful source of benevolence and forgiveness. It's like, I know you're a human being. Thanks for trying. Let's keep trying. I got my arm around you. I like to keep it simple.
It's beautiful. One more?
Yeah, I have a question. Is this on? I have a question about a very dear friend that lives in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where I think you and Amy played recently.
We did, yeah.
She has enjoyed living there for 32 years. She's a mother of 2 children. Her son is 28 and has become a very devout Southern Baptist. And her daughter's 24 and is a lesbian. And they're having some tension in the family about how the 2 siblings, they're the only 2 siblings they have, and the daughter's very concerned about losing the love of her older brother, and what kind of advice she might have for them.
Oh. That sounds complicated to me. I think that it would be important for her to be honest that she, if it's, as you're saying, as I hear it, she's wounded or fearful of losing the love and relationship of a brother. She loves him, and so I think it's important to be honest about that on a very, say, this really hurts me, I feel sadness over this, but there also comes a certain point, and for many people it takes time, where after a while you just don't put up with being ostracized, judged, and you just have to say, you're my brother, but I'm breaking up with you. And it sounds like she isn't anywhere near that. If he's just converted or whatever, and it sounds like who knows what happened within the family and what has stirred him. But I think you have to be honest about your pain, and then if there continues to be, because if he is abusive in any way, meaning judgmental or cutting her off, then there just will come a time where it's so that she can be free in her life. She says, we tried, but this just isn't.
Yeah. And so often, and I don't know anything about this case, but so often religious ideas and language is kind of like a presenting problem. The real problem is deeper and located in family tanglements and generational issues that have gone on a long time. We need the best psychological insight we can, and the best sociological insight, family systems insight. So often religious language gets used as we say, a kind of presenting problem, if I may put it in that direction. But I agree with everything my daughter has said on that issue.
And I think that those of us who are moved to in our own lives, we just say a little prayer for their healing. I believe in prayer.
Yeah. Have mercy. Kyrie, Kyrie, Kyrie. You can sing it with Bach, and you can just cry it out like,
you could sing it with Madonna.
You could sing it with Madonna. You. That's good.
We thank you both.
I don't want to end on that note.
No, that was beautiful. I thought that was great. I thought that was fantastic. It was, intergenerational.
Yeah.
Poor Dad, he's used to this. 4 daughters and a wife and 2 female cats, and not that gender has anything to do with it, but we
I've had an
it's
education.
a repartee.
I've had an education.
To close tonight, I want to say thanks to Jerry and Hannah Reese for making this possible. And then I also want to just have one final word from each of you. Your greatest wish for the world.
Wow.
And you're not allowed to say world peace because it's not not the Miss America pageant, You're both so profound, so it has to be something profound,
This is called a setup. Yeah. What do you think? What would you say? I mean, we can't say everything.
I wish that God would give us a little more help.
Okay. Very enough. Yeah.
We're struggling.
That's what the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer. I teach a lot on prayer and theology, and the Lord's Prayer is so innocent from one point of view. People say it, they mumble it. I've said it, I've mumbled it, and then something happens in life, and you cry that prayer. Oh God, not our will anymore now. But I guess if I had one phrase, and I can't use the big ones, you've disallowed those, it would be with Mary Oliver. Just pay attention, world. Does anyone know the kind of beauty that's here? Does anyone know what human love is like that will endure time and suffering and death and life? Pay attention, world. That's why I think Mary Oliver is one of our great lyrical theologians. And she just says, keep listening and paying attention. Come to your senses. So that's my wish.
I want that one.
You like that one?
I want you. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your humanity, your opinions, your thoughts, your gifts musically and theologically, and we're so grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
And there's tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's good. Appreciate it.
Thank you.